In the previous lesson, we learned how to throw an error and redirect a user to an error page if we have an error with our API. Now, inside of our home page, if we have an error with our API, we don't want to create a new error and direct the user to a full-on error page. And the reason why we don't want to do this is because we have other content that we're displaying on the page that isn't dependent on the API request. So what would be better in this example is if we have an error with our API, we can display that within our template. So what we can do is apply a vif directive to the grid container. And then what we can check for is to make sure we don't have an error within our API. So as long as we don't have an error, we can display our recipe cards. Now, if we do have an error, then what we want to do is just output a message saying that something went wrong. So what we can do is on our paragraph tag is we can use the velse directive to render out this paragraph tag if this statement is not true. So if we do have an error, then we're not going to render out our recipe cards. We're instead going to render out this error message. And if you wanted to, instead of outputting this custom error message, you could output the message that comes from the error variable. So now if we force our API to fail by providing it a wrong URL and we save this, now back inside of the application, you can see we're going to see our error message saying that something went wrong, to please try again later. Alright, so to wrap up this project, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. Now for a recipe card, it would probably be a lot better if we had this encapsulated inside of a component. So inside of our components folder, let's create a new file and we'll call this recipe card.view. And then within here, we can just scaffold out our view boilerplate. Now inside of this component, we're going to have our recipe as a prop. So what we want to do is we're going to start off by importing the type of recipe from our types file. Then we'll want to define our prop using the define prop macro. And we'll call this prop recipe, and then we want to assign it to the type that we imported called recipe. And within the index.view file, we can just copy the markup for our recipe card and we can paste it within our new component. And then we'll just want to remove the v4 directive as we're going to be iterating over this within our index.view file still. And since the param that we had within our index.view file was recipe and then our prop is called recipe, we don't need to make any modifications to how we're referencing our data here inside of this component. And now within the index.view, we can remove the markup for our recipe card. And now we can just use our recipe card component. And what we'll want to do is apply our v4 loop as well as define our proper recipe, and we'll set this equal to the param that we have in the v4 loop called recipe. And here in the application, nothing should have changed, but what we did is instead of having all this markup sit inside of our file, we have now encapsulated our logic into a component which we could reuse throughout our application. Now in this project, we have a few times where we use this markup right here to create ourselves a button. And very similar to how we created a component for the recipe card, it would probably be a good approach to create a component for our button. So within the components folder, let's create a new file for this button and we'll call this base btn. And within this file, we just want to scaffold out our new view boilerplate. And for this component, we're going to have two props. One's going to be for the label, and the other one's going to be the to prop, which will be the to attribute that we have on the Nuxt link component. So back inside of a recipe card component, we can just copy the markup we have for our current button, and we can paste that here inside of our base button component. And what we'll want to do is replace the to prop on the Nuxt link component with the to prop that is being defined here inside of our script. So we can remove this and just replace this with to. And for the content of the button, we can just use the label prop. And if you wanted to make this button a little bit more dynamic, we could also wrap our label prop inside of a slot tag. And what this will allow you to do is if you wanted to customize the button, maybe you wanted to add an icon or do something like that, you could pass in a slot, and then what will happen is it'll override the default value that we have set here with that slotted content. And back within our recipe card component, instead of having all this markup like we do right now, we can replace this with our base button component, and then we can just apply the props. So the first one we want to apply is going to be our to prop, and then we also want to provide the label. So we can say label, and we can set this to view. And again, here inside of our application, you can see nothing has changed, but now we have encapsulated even more logic into a component, and we can reuse this throughout our application in the various spots that we are using a button.